This month, December 2019, marks 100 years since the introduction of this Land Settlement Act. The Act aimed to resettle people across rural areas in Scotland following the First World War through the creation of smallholdings and crofts. The Act made land available across Scotland and also resettled people back into communities which had been facing significant population decline in the previous years. Many see the Act as a pivotal part of our land reform history in Scotland. It's also a timely reminder that land reform and the connection between land ownership and use and the wider efforts needed around rural renewal are not new things. To mark this centenary, the Scottish Land Commission is publishing a paper by Professor Jim Hunter, who's here with me today. The paper analyses the impact that the Land Settlement Act had at the time and also the legacy we continue to see today in the pattern of land ownership in many areas of Scotland. It also encourages us to think about what's needed and what lessons we can learn in terms of addressing the current population crisis we're seeing in small and fragile rural communities across Scotland. So, Jim, can you tell me a little bit more about the legacy of the Land Settlement Act and the impact it had on the ground?
It had a pretty enormous impact. It led to the creation of several thousand new crofts and smallholdings right across the country, mainly in the first instance in the Highlands, but later in other parts of Scotland as well. And it had two sort of origins, if you like, one long run and one relatively short run, the short run one having to do with the First World War, and the long run one going back quite a long way into the 1880s and the agitation that there then was in the crofting areas of Scotland to really deal with the situation created by clearance, and people were looking for security of tenure and all of that. And that was followed by legislation, the Crofters Act of 1886. So all of that was, from a crofting point of view, a huge step forward. It made further clearance and eviction impossible. But what didn't happen then was something else that crofters very much wanted to happen. They wanted to get back quite a lot of the land that had been cleared and emptied of people in the earlier part of the 19th century. And so from that point of view, the legislation that came along in the 1880s didn't really do the job, and that led to a lot more agitation, which was to culminate in the passing of the Land Settlement Act.
And in many ways it's seen as being very radical today. Could you explain a bit more about the radical elements to that, and what was the reason that enabled the politicians to be more ambitious than they had previously been able to do?
The Act was very radical. It was radical at the time and seen as such, and it would be seen in some ways perhaps as even more radical today. There was already in existence as a result of attempts to promote what was called land settlement, what we might call repopulation or repeopling. There had been set up in 1911, 1912, an organisation called the Board of Agriculture for Scotland. And the board had various powers to create smallholdings. But in the first instance, in the first 2 or 3 years after it was created, it didn't get very far. It didn't have much funding, it was understaffed, and it ran into all sorts of legal complexity about compensation to landowners whose land was effectively being used to create these smallholdings. And then came the First World War, and the war started in August 1914. And for the first 2 years or so of the war, despite the fact that Britain needed literally millions of soldiers, the government relied solely on volunteers. It wasn't until 1916 that was conscription. And from the Highlands, per head of population, so to speak, the rate of volunteering was extremely high, exceptionally high. And this also sort of created a momentum that these men, when they came back, assuming they did come back, would get a land. And on recruiting platforms, government ministers and others promised that they would get land. And so that created a new sort of impetus to do something more far-reaching than had been done before. It also meant that whereas before the First World War, all of this was surrounded by quite a lot of political contention, the government of the time, and the government from about 1906 through to the beginning of the war, was a liberal government, the government in London in the UK. And it was committed to a degree of land reform, but the opposition, the Conservative and Unionist Party at that point, tended to be rather opposed to it. But the war had the effect of getting the two sides together, so to speak. And the coalition government that was established in 1916, headed by David Lloyd George, was a liberal and conservative government. And it continued after the war and won an overwhelming victory in the 1918 general election that was held just a few weeks after the armistice that ended the war. And in the promises that were being made politically at that point, there was huge emphasis on what Lloyd George called homes fit for heroes. And some of these, you know, in retrospect, a lot of that rhetoric wasn't really acted on, but something that was acted on was the notion that not just homes were needed for heroes in places like the Highlands, but land. And so the act was the powers of the Board of Agriculture were hugely beefed up. It got much more money, and it got very far-reaching powers to acquire by compulsion, if necessary, land from landowners, whether or not they wanted to sell it. And in some ways even more radical, it had the power to impose on landowners, without the sale of the land, a mechanism whereby they had to create on the land smallholdings, even if left to their own devices, they wouldn't have done that. So very far-reaching, and the sort of thing that I think today would be found rather difficult to bring about. So two circumstances: the long-run one going back, way back into the 19th century, the desire to get back land that was cleared, and the more immediate one, the change in emphasis, the feeling of an obligation owed to returning soldiers, that something had to be done for them. And in the Highland context in particular, that was give them the land that they'd been demanding for generations.
And in the paper that we're publishing together, you talk quite specifically about some of the communities, you know, the families and the communities who were able to access land following the Act, particularly, for example, the North Talisker estate, what's now known as the community of Portnalong in Skye. Could you talk a bit more detail about how that happened and what it meant for those families who were given that land to be able to you know, build better homes and be able to grow crops and sustain themselves in a way which they hadn't been able to previously?
Well, I think that's a kind of interesting example. It's a particularly dramatic one in some ways, and that area, that whole area, had been cleared. There had been people living there if you went back to the early 19th century, but they were all kicked out, as it were, in the early 19th century. And so the area was completely depopulated. It had been a very large-scale sheep farm, which of course is why these evictions and clearances happened, to create sheep farming in the first place. The Board of Agriculture, just after the war in 1920, bought in excess of 60,000 acres from the MacLeod estate, MacLeod of MacLeod in Dunvegan, and that included the Portnalong area. It had previously been the North Talisker sheep farm. And the board then created something like 68 crofts on that land, on what had been arable land way back and now was going to be arable land again. And the rest of the sheep farm was the common grazing, if you like, of these crofters. And what's particularly striking about that instance is that the vast bulk of the people who were settled there came from Harris or Lewis, mainly from Harris. And these were places where there was huge demand for small holdings, and particularly from the east side of Harris, where people, again, it was a result of clearance earlier. People had been moved from the much more productive Atlantic coast of the island and dumped in what are called the Bays of Harris, a very rocky area where if you go there, you kind of think there's more rock than grass or anything else. And so these people got the chance to move in 1923 to North Talisker. And they came. I mean, one of the remarkable things about this from a modern perspective, I think, is how rapidly it was done.
Yeah.
You know, we talked today about perhaps the repopulation of somewhere like the island of Ulva, of Mull, for instance, and the time scale tends to be in years, if not decades. And in the case of North Talisker, in a matter of weeks in 1923, the population of the area went from 0 to around 400. And these families were settled initially in timber huts, fairly substantial wooden huts that the Board of Agriculture had bought from the army at the end of the war. And but they were also given assistance, you know, very generous financial assistance to provide permanent homes and so on. And so they were, and the crofts they got were substantial crofts by, you know, 20 acres or more, which is quite big by crofting standards. And so from their perspective, because many of them, all of them, wouldn't have had land of their own in the islands where they came from, Harris and Lewis, and now they had these crofts. The land was relatively good. They had a huge extent of common grazing and a big sheep flock that they managed collectively. That's a so-called club stock farm. And so from their point of view, it was a remarkable change for the better, and I think it's still remembered as such. When I was writing this paper for the Land Commission, I went there again. I've known the area for quite some time, and there's a man there, Danny MacLeod, whom I knew when I worked for the Crofters Union way back, and Danny's parents came from Harris and settled there in 1923. He went to school there in the 1930s. He's in his 80s now, but still very much involved in the community. And speaking with him about what it was like way back then and about what his parents and their contemporaries felt about it, it's very, very evident that this was, from their perspective, an enormous kind of liberation, if you like. It was a huge thing. And what it did also, when you go there today, it's very, very striking. You know, I also went to have a look at Ulva when I was doing this just a week or two before I went to Portnalong. And Ulva is still largely empty. It was cleared and people were kicked out of there as well. And then you go to Portnalong and it's a peopled landscape. There are lots of houses and there's lots of activity. And the contrast is very, very striking. And I think to the casual visitor, if you go to Portnalong, you'd think, well, these are communities that have just evolved here over centuries, but they haven't. They're you know, less than 100 years old, and they're entirely a result of the Act, the Land Settlement Act of 1919.
So as a historian, would you say that that Act really had quite a transformative effect in the pattern of land ownership that we're seeing, particularly in the Highlands, in areas, and in terms of the legacy that we can still see today on the ground?
Yeah, the Act did have a really transformative effect. It varied hugely from place to place, but particularly in some parts of the islands, like some parts of Skye, like we've been talking about, Razzie, which was repopulated at much the same time. And even more strikingly, I think, in the Outer Isles, in the Uists and Lewis and Harris. Large areas today that, you know, you would think had just been the way they are, as it were, in terms of population for long enough, were repeopled, repopulated. And I remember watching a television documentary about the islands a year or two ago, and somebody travelling up the west side of Uist and into the west side of Harris and going on about the timeless nature of these communities. And I was thinking all the time, well, they're not timeless. They're far more recent creations than Solihull Street or Princess Street in Edinburgh. These streets have been there a heck of a lot longer than these communities have been. So yes, it had a really pretty major impact, and not just in the Highlands, because the initial impetus tended to be in the Highlands, partly because the Act, it was passed obviously at this time of year in 1919, but that was over a year after the war, and a lot of young men had come home with promises of land ringing in their ears, and they just took the land. They got fed up of waiting and occupied the land illegally, of course. And so the initial impetus was to deal with this and kind of deal with this unrest and what was called land raiding. And I particularly like a story of a group of young land raiders in North Uist, and they'd occupied a huge tract of farmland. And these were young men, you know, early 20s, if that, just back from 2, 3, 4 years of war. And of course, the sheriff court orders were issued to instruct them to remove themselves from the land, which they ignored entirely. And one of them, when asked why this was, he said, in effect, well, we've spent 4 years facing the Germans and we don't give a damn for the sheriff. So there was real strong feeling, and government, to its credit, and the Board of Agriculture as a government agency were looking to deal with this. I mean, some of these people were jailed and so on, but nevertheless, they got ultimately what they wanted. But then in later times, you know, as the 1920s went on and into the 1930s, the Board of Agriculture was very active in creating smallholdings in other parts of Scotland, in the Eastern Highlands, in the Black Isle, and Caithness, and places like that, but also in Dumfriesshire in the southwest. And then increasingly in the 1930s, setting up smallholdings, 10 acres or so, on the margins of cities.
Yeah. I mean, it's very striking that, you know, in this month, December 2019, we are celebrating 100 years since the Act was passed, but we're also seeing similar challenges in some of Scotland's remote rural areas in terms of population decline. What do you think are some of the most important lessons that we can learn from the Act in terms of its relevance still today, and what we can do now to address the current population problems we're seeing?
Well, I think there are things to be learned from it. I think the commitment, the political commitment to making it happen, was very, very strong at that time, and from all sides politically. This was not an area of policy that at that point was subject to a lot of political division. But also, I think beyond that, it's just the sheer priority that it got. And it would be my feeling that, yes, there's an emerging need that's recognized politically to deal with population issues, particularly in further afield parts of the country. But it doesn't have anything like the impetus now that it did 100 years ago. There are aspects of what was done technically, I think, that can be learned from. It was, and perhaps this isn't something that would want to be replicated today, it was very, very top-down. There was pressure, obviously, from the folk on the ground to make it happen by way of land raids and so on. But once the Board of Agriculture moved into an area like North Talisker or wherever it might be, it was them who decided entirely where the crofts should be, who should get the crofts, all of that. And I think today, you know, the tendency in land reform, particularly in community ownership over the last 20, 30 years, has been that these sorts of decisions should be taken by people themselves on the ground. So I think that would be something that ideally today would be done differently. What I think would be really, really helpful, however, is if, without wishing to replicate precisely what was done in the past, if there was an agency that had the sort of powers that the Board of Agriculture had at that time, not just to do with the land in the sense of creating crofts and small farms and so on, but with providing housing. Because the absolute key issue in terms of rural population today is the lack of affordable housing. And it's quite extraordinary how generous the assistance was to people to provide themselves with their own homes. So I feel myself, it's just a personal opinion, that if one was able to create, I don't know what you would call them, population action areas or something, and that some agency had the powers, or similar powers to those that the Board of Agriculture had, then you could see these things perhaps being tackled far more speedily and effectively.
I mean, certainly one of the ideas that the Land Commission has been looking at since we started a couple of years ago is the concept of public interest-led development, where development for land, for housing, for other types of investment and infrastructure needs are various different stakeholders, including local community and community organisations.
Yeah, that whole area, I think, needs exploring. And you know, over the last few decades, I guess, we've moved away from that thinking. But if you think not just of something like the Board of Agriculture, but the new town corporations that were set up just after the Second World War, and urban communities like Livingston or Glenrothes or whatever were not exactly magicked into existence, but through agencies like that, all sorts of things could be done. Land could be acquired, housing could be provided, all sorts of facilities could be provided. And I think, yes, if there were some possibility of moving in that direction and getting, if you like, the best aspects of what happened in the past with perhaps the best aspects of what's available now in terms of much more genuine local involvement and more local democracy, if you like, I think that would be really, really good to see that. Because I think in the past, these matters were handled very, very centrally. And yes, huge things were achieved and much good was done. But I think in today's circumstances, we'd want more of the power, so to speak, to reside in the locality. So yeah.
Absolutely. And bearing that in mind, then, looking back in order to look to the future, what should we not do? What lesson can we learn from the way in which the Act was introduced and implemented on the ground, where there were problems and where there were things where maybe support wasn't given in the right direction, that we should learn from in terms of thinking about what to do now?
That there was, real ill feeling around a lot of this in the first instance. And when we look back, it seems remarkable what was accomplished. But at the time, from the perspective of people on the ground, not nearly enough was being done fast enough. And we don't face the same set of pressures today, obviously. But I do think we need to be absolutely certain, well, as certain as anyone can ever be, as to what exactly is needed in different localities. I think also not necessarily to impose identical solutions everywhere, which tended to be the situation at that time, and to think, what would be most appropriate in particular localities. And even something as basic in terms of land as at that time, the huge emphasis was on creating more smallholdings and crofts and so on. Now, there may well be demand for that today as well, so that could be an element in it. But I think much more fundamentally today, it's the housing side of it, and indeed other types of infrastructure. The Board of Agriculture didn't just provide housing or help to provide housing, it provided access roads and all of that. And today, yes, something similar would need to be done, but also beyond that, and perhaps even more fundamental. And I think that's one perhaps important lesson from what was done in the past, that the focus was entirely on the land use aspect of this. And it didn't extend into how do we develop the economies of these localities. And so even though it was a huge success in getting people back and getting housing and small holdings back into these localities that had been emptied, its longer run impact was less favorable than it might have been because there was no emphasis on doing anything beyond that. So often in places where this happened, there would then begin to be again by the late 20s, 30s, and into the period after the Second World War, more depopulation. And it's interesting on the west side of Harris, for instance, which was resettled in this period, though it tended to be into the early 1930s rather than the 20s. But all the crofts that were created then, that was a huge step forward in an area that had been emptied of people 100 years before. But in more recent times, that area became very badly affected by renewed depopulation just because of lack of non-croft housing and no economic activity. And that's why in that locality, the community decided 10 or so years ago to take the place over themselves. So they established community ownership in place of the ownership of the state that had been there since the 30s. And they've achieved pretty remarkable success in terms of housing provision and repopulation and so on. So I think there's a lesson there that you need to think about these things as widely as possible.
So thank you very much for being here with me today, Jim. It was fascinating to hear about the Land Settlement Act, the impact it had in Scotland, as well as the impact it continues to have in terms of its legacy around land ownership patterns, particularly in the crofting communities. I feel like we could have sat here and discussed the implications for many more hours. It seems particularly pertinent 100 years after the introduction of this Act in terms of some of the challenges we're facing today, not just in terms of what needs to be done to address the population decline in some of our sparsely populated rural areas, but also the bigger challenges around how to ensure that our land is used in the most productive way it can be, that we manage to achieve inclusive growth, and also the way in which Scotland responds to some of the more global dilemmas we're facing, such as the climate emergency. So it's great to discuss this with you. For those of you interested in reading more about this, our paper will be available on the Scottish Land Commission website, and hard copies are also available from the Scottish Land Commission. So thank you again, Jim. We hope that this is a stimulus for a discussion about how we can all, what we can all do to address these issues over the coming months. Thank you very much.